Okay, thank you very much, everybody, for joining this session. This is in the Made Simple stream at this year's Charity Accountants Conference. My name is Judith Miller. I'm from St Vincent. So I am an auditor underneath this, and I've been a chartered accountant for over 25 years now. I've been a trustee for close to 20, and I do have an interest in good governance, which is why I've been chosen to present this session to you this afternoon. So we're focusing on the Charity Governance Code and what you can do in your roles as finance leads within organisations to support improved governance within the organisation. So the plan is I'm going to launch a couple of polls in a minute to see how you're getting on, and it'll be useful to take the temperature and see where people are on their governance journey. So we're going to do that first. Then what I'm going to do is I will talk through the headlines of the Charity Governance Code, and then talk through some of the tools that organisations are using to apply it. And then there'll be some time at the end plenty of time at the end for your questions. Do either hold your question to the end. You will be able to raise your hand and actually ask it verbally. But if you would like to place a question in the chat as we go through, then please do so, and we'll pick up as many as we can when we get to the end of the session. So what you can see on the slide are the key components of the Charity Governance Code. Many of you will be familiar with it. It was originally launched back in July 2017, and then refreshed in December 2020 following the first consultation on its use. And at that point in time, we saw two of the principles really refreshed: the principle on integrity, and also the principle that was previously called diversity is now called equality, diversity and inclusion. So that's the code, which is what's going to be the focus of what we talk about for the next hour. Forgive me if I gaze over to my other screen instead of at you all of the time, but my slides are up there. What I'd like to do, though, is to get a sense of where you might be on your governance journey. So I've got a couple of questions to ask you. So the first question, and we're going to have about a minute for you to answer this, is has your charity actually assessed its governance against the code itself? So there are 5 different options in there. If you'd like to choose the one that best really reflects where you might be. So there are a few yes answers based on sort of different approaches. It's fair to say, I'm sure there will be some of you out there who've not started a journey with the governance code, but it will be useful to see where you all are. So I can see the numbers rising, so we'll give you a few more minutes until we've got complete uptake on that poll. I think it's always useful to reflect at the beginning of the session and get a sense of where all your peers in this session might be. So we've got a few more people left to cast their vote, so we'll give it another few seconds. Okay, we've had over a minute and a half, so I am going to end the poll there and just share the results with you. So we've got both polls actually ran at the same time. Forgive me, that's my unfamiliarness with Zoom itself. So really interesting mix there. A lot of you have said it's a work in progress. I think that's fair to say for many organisations, and it's interesting because the tool is very much, the code rather, is very much positioned as a governance tool. and the expectation is that it's all about continuous improvement. Interesting that none of you have had external support to do it. I think that probably reflects that most of the charities I come across, although I must say where I'm a trustee, we have engaged some external support to help us with that. And we've got about a quarter of you who've not started the journey yet. And in terms of whether you comment on it in your annual report, because that is one of the expectations in the code, is that you include a brief statement. So about 6 of you are saying yes, you do. Another 6 are not yet, but you plan to, and about 15 of you not quite yet. So I'm just going to stop sharing those results. But thank you for sharing those with us. So let's just take a look at the Charity Governance Code, and I'll do this relatively quickly because I'm conscious that many of you will be familiar with it. So that's it as it stands as at December 2020. I think that the biggest challenge, and when I talk to many of my clients, is when they reflect on the governance code itself, sometimes it can feel a bit like eating an elephant, and you fear that you're going to spend so much time focusing on the governance structure itself that perhaps you don't spend enough time on governing. So that's always a bit of a conflict, but it's really important to make sure that we have got that essential framework in place. So it's about getting the balance right. This is an interesting quote. I'm sure many of you will have heard of it. It's from Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and we use it on the Inspiring Financial Leadership course. But really, it's about thinking, where you want to get to with this. I think it's very easy, and I include myself in this as a finance professional. The code itself, with all of its recommendations, sort of lends itself to a checklist, and you ticking them all off. But that's just literally using it as a checklist, and you've got to actually stand back and reflect on the process by which you actually assess how you're performing against the code, because actually going through an appropriate process will help trustees actually engage in all of the principles and actually help you move the organisation on to hopefully better functioning governance. So it's about what is the end in mind, and ultimately the end in mind is effective governance, meaning an effective organisation delivering better for your beneficiaries. So whilst this may feel like whilst obviously the Charity Governance Code is not something you legally have to comply with, it shouldn't feel like a compliance orientated approach, but try and think of the process in terms of achieving more effective governance as you go through the process itself. So it's about balancing, reflecting on how you govern with actually governing as well. And it is fair to say that there isn't a single size fits all in terms of what good governance looks like. It changes and evolves over your organisation's life as you change, grow, deliver different things. And so it's working out what is proportionate and appropriate to you. And obviously there are over 70 recommendations within the governance code itself. And while some of you may well be familiar with the governance codes in the corporate world, it's very much more regulatory, and they use the expression comply or explain, this expectation that you do comply with it or explain why you don't. Whereas in the charity sector, the language is quite different, because it's about best practice and it's all about applying or explaining. So picking the things amongst the recommendations that are appropriate and applicable to you, and think about proportionality, what's right for your organisation. I like the expression, it's a stretch tool as well. It's very much, when you read the introduction to the governance code, it's there for organisations to be aspirational and also to think about improving their governance over the medium and longer term, so to keep coming back to it. So it's about continuous improvement. And then you might think, well, what's the role of finance? I'm a finance person here, so isn't the role of governance, doesn't that really sit with the chair, the trustees, maybe the chair, chief executive partnership, maybe the stuff around governance, shouldn't that sit there? And I've thought about it quite a lot. And I think one of the privileges, I think, of being involved in finance is actually you almost get an access all areas pass to all bits of the organisation, because you need to understand the operating model in order to sort of support the budgeting and the financial planning process and the reporting process, and to enable and support colleagues and also board members. So I think finance professionals have a very particular view on the whole of the organisation. So we can come at it with this whole organisation perspective. I also think that the financial responsibilities around trusteeship and governance are key, and they are quite challenging. And so I think in order to get trustees to fully engage in the financial agenda, if we are more involved in the full governance framework, then hopefully we can create safe spaces for them to engage in governance in the appropriate way. So I think we've got skin in the game, if you like, in terms of our commitment to ensuring that good governance gets done. I think what's also interesting when you work your way through all of the individual principles, I think pretty much through all of them, there are some recommendations that really closely relate to our role as finance people in organisations. But in particular, I would say there are a couple of principles. Principle 4 around decision making and risk. There's a lot in there that really sits in the finance area of responsibility. And also the last principle, which is around openness and accountability. There's also a lot in there because that's about transparency, and obviously our role actually is so fundamentally linked to the annual report and accounts, which I'd say is one of our key communication documents. So that's why we've got, I think, a close connection and need to have that close connection to the application of the governance code. I think as finance people, we're quite good at making assessments. I think it fits with our professional skill set. So I think we can help our peers and board members. I've already mentioned the annual report. And I think genuinely, everybody within an organisation, in the management team and the trustee board, have got a part to play in ensuring the governance process works effectively. So in terms of improving your governance, what is it? Properly understanding what the governance code is, having an assessment of where you are now, and then identifying how you improve it. So a quick canter through what is it. There are two codes out there. Having said it came out in 2017, there are two versions, one for organisations with income under $1 million and one for organisations with income over $1 million. That cut-off really there reflects the point at which you have an external audit. I'll be completely honest, I would say that the one for smaller organisations isn't that much different. There are a few fewer recommendations, but there aren't really any fundamental differences. So if you suddenly go up into the category of being audited, you won't find a lot more to be doing. So you've got all of the principles. When you pick up the governance code, the way each principle is structured is like that. You've got a defining principle, then a very clear rationale, a set of outcomes, and then the recommended practice. It's also very useful at the back. There is a glossary of terms. The foundation principle, which I would hope that is really covered off really well in organisations' induction. This really is about making sure that the charity context is clear and the basic trustee responsibilities are clear as well. And I'm sure that most of you will include CC3, the essential trustee, in your induction pack. So it's making sure that new trustees really understand those key responsibilities and duties, and also get a copy of the governing document that gives them the piece really about the charity governance, sorry, the charity context. And what you're looking for is people who understand their roles and responsibilities and are committed to the principles of good governance and continuous improvement. Now, what I'm not sharing with you is all of the detailed recommendations. You can go after the session and read them for yourselves if you're not already familiar with them. But I think the things that sometimes we risk doing when we make our assessment is we sometimes jump straight into looking at how we're doing against the individual recommendations. But actually, it's really important to actually understand what is the outcome we want to achieve. So I've shared that on all of these slides, and we will get these after the session. So principle one is about organizational purpose. So what you're trying to get to is the shared understanding. And it can be surprising that, you know, you see a set of strategic objectives on paper, but people's take on what those actually mean can vary from trustee to trustee, which is why the importance, I think, of not just doing some sort of assessment, but actually genuinely getting under the skin of the expected outcomes is really important. And I'll come back to how you might do that a bit later. So you've got sort of demonstrating you're effective at achieving your purpose and outcomes. And there's a role in here for finance, because some of the things around organizational purpose include aspects like ensuring your income streams are sustainable, and also you challenge your operating model. So you consider whether it continues to be appropriate for you to operate as a single charity. Should you collaborate more? Should you merge? Either because there are other people doing things as well as you and you could do them better together, or perhaps there might be a challenge to your future viability, which might mean that collaborative working or potential merger might be appropriate. Principle two, you've got it about leadership. And I've underlined some of the key words. These aren't underlined in the code themselves, but the point about collective responsibility is so crucial. And I'm sure you'll be familiar when you're trying to talk about the finances that that's not an area of comfort for many trustees, but trying to communicate the nature of collective responsibility is particularly critical. So there's the leadership piece and the outcomes there. Now, in the back end of 2020, it was the integrity principle. I've already mentioned that this was updated. And in particular, what they changed there was actually bringing in reference to NCEO's charity ethical principles and also the Nolan principles, and underlining the importance of having a code of conduct. And that's very clear throughout the code, I think. It's not just about having the appropriate structures and processes in place for good governance, but it's about ensuring that your behaviours actually reflect the values of the organisation. So behaviours are obviously, I'd almost say, the most important part of effective governance. So you've got the integrity principle there. You can also see in outcome 4 that point about not being unduly influenced. And I think the overlap with us as finance people is that in that whole point about ensuring conflicts of interest are appropriately managed. As finance people, we may be custodians of the register of interests, and we obviously have to be mindful when we're preparing the annual report and accounts that we're transparent again about related party transactions and so on. So that really gets picked up there. I mentioned the Nolan principles, which you've got there on the right, and also NCEO's ethical principles, which have been picked up and referenced in the governance code. Then decision-making, risk and control. This is the one I think where we have most to do with, I think. So it's about sound decision-making processes, having a monitoring framework, both financial KPIs and non-financial KPIs. It's also about effective risk management, so balancing an appetite to take risk as well as avoiding being overcautious. So getting the balance right, and risk often does fall in our remit as well. You've then got board effectiveness, which I think links up very nicely with the integrity piece, and you can see there the important culture, behaviours coming through there, really, and making sure that there is a culture where you can have constructive conversations, where you don't have a blame culture, where you can have open conversations about things that go well and things that don't go so well. So you can engage in lessons learned processes as well. So that's the board effectiveness piece. So a lot more in the code itself on that. Then the The other principle that was updated just before Christmas last year was the diversity principle, really reflecting that since the code originally came back out in 2017, a lot really has changed in this space, and in terms of the requirements and expectations in the sector. I think it's fair to say this is probably one of the harder principles for trustee boards to really get under the skin of, and I would say this is where you probably need some really effective facilitation in terms of having a board discussion about what does equality, diversity, and inclusion really mean for your organisation. I think that there's a lot for all of us to examine when we reflect on the EDI piece. Particularly challenging our own assumptions. There's a lot to reflect on around our unconscious bias. We have to challenge our presumptions that we have to start with. So I think there's a balance to be struck here between making sure that we reflect on our issues such as unconscious bias. There needs to be an openness and a willingness of a board of trustees to engage in training on this area as well. I think that's really important. I think when you're starting off on the EDI piece, I think the area to focus in on really is ensuring that your recruitment processes are appropriate, both in terms of the staff team, but also in terms of the trustee board. I would say those are the most effective starting points. I would say that what's been interesting with the arrival of the pandemic, we've seen many boards of trustees reflect on the relevance of their strategy, partly because we've been working in this digital environment, and with the upheaval of COVID, people have said, does our strategy remain relevant? But amongst all of that, what we've been seeing, which I think is very, very heartening, but extremely important, is that many organisations are picking up on this strand or this key theme of equality, diversity and inclusion, and either embedding it as a separate strategic objective or seeing it as a cross-cutting theme across the organisation. And I think the repositioning of it in the Charity Governance Code has helped with that as well. And then the final principle really is about openness and accountability. I know that sometimes as finance people, whether you're on the preparation side or whether you're on the auditing side, I think preparing the annual report and accounts can feel quite burdensome in terms of the level of expectation of what you need to put in it. But I think transparency is vitally important, and we as finance professionals need to champion that. So being honest and open through our reporting is one of the strands that actually comes through this principle 7. So that's the code, just in headline terms. And so if you're well on the way to, and you've already assessed, say, pre-December 2020, how you're doing, really it's picking up on the integrity and the EDI principles. Those are the ones I would prioritise next. But I would like to ask you, I'm not going to put a poll up on the screen, but just like you to reflect to yourselves, if you were just to score yourselves out of 10, to say, how is your organisation doing on sort of compliance or application of the code itself, where would you, 10 out of 10 is fabulous, you've got it, it's all singing or dancing, it's wonderful. Naught's going to be, well, we haven't really started yet. Some of you might say, well, we're about halfway through, we're about a 5. Some of you might say we're 7, others maybe a 9 out of 10. But just while I'm just sort of talking over the next couple of minutes, think where you might be. I'm not asking you to tell me, but just think where you might be on a score of 1 to 10, and we'll come back to the score at the very end. So now what I want to share is some of the things that I hope will be useful to you. So how do you go about improving your governance? So a few really useful tools out there, which I'm going to signpost you to. Some of you will be aware, and I've got the book here, of Deborah's book that she published last October. It's A Battle on the Board. I think this is an absolutely great book about trusteeship. And I recommend it to all the boards I come across. But what you can pick up in there in chapter 7 is there is a particular chapter which gives you a little framework really to sort of assess, well, where are we? You can give it to trustees. They can mark themselves out of 10 on each of the individual principles. Maybe get the management team to do it as well. I think that can be really helpful in getting a better understanding and a mutual understanding, really, of where both teams, if you like, are really coming from, and trying to reach a common understanding. So yeah, get management team, trustees to maybe score it, and obviously some of the principles will score better than others. But I think that gives you a really useful starting point to be able to say, because you can't deal with it all at once, where do we actually start? This is just an example of the table that is used in Deborah's book. So it talks about organisational purpose. So what does this really mean? And then it gives some examples of some of the things that you might be doing that will help you gauge whether you're a 2, whether you're a 9, whether you're a 10, whatever. So I think that's a really, really useful tool. The other thing that the DSC have actually launched is a free app as well, which helps you do this type of assessment, and the details of that are on their website. So nice, simple, easy tools really to really put your toe in take the temperature of the water, gauge where you are, and try and identify which of the principles you may need to prioritise for action. There is another tool out there, and I quite like this one as well. It's from NCBO. It's called the Governance Wheel. Now, for quite a long time during the pandemic, all of NCBO's resources were freely available. Now, I'm not sure whether this one is beyond the paywall at the moment, but you'll probably be familiar with this type of diagram, and you could prepare one for yourself. And again, it's very similar to the way Deborah approaches it, with a sort of score out of 10. It's quite a nice one of these sort of spider diagrams. And if you are NCBO's members or have access to the governance, this particular governance wheel, I think what's really helpful that they do there is, in the scores 1 to 10, you can see on the right-hand side of the spider diagram. So 1 or 2, you're at risk. 3 to 4, you're probably aware. 5 to 6, you're getting a handle on it. You're getting a grip of it. You're pretty competent in 7 and 8. You're excellent if you're in 9 or 10. But what's really quite helpful about the NCBO governance wheel is that they don't go into quite a lot of detail about what you might see happening within an organisation, maybe who is at risk, right through to one that is excellent. So rather than you coming up with a relatively subjective sort of gut feeling, oh, I think we're a 5, I think the NCBO tool really lifts it off the page and says, well, if you're competent, this is what you should see happening in the organisation. I think that's really helpful. So those are 2 tools which I would definitely signpost you to, in terms of saying, where are we now? What are the principles we need to focus on? And I've said this bit already, but don't just look at the score. Try and make sure that there is some decent time for trustees to discuss some of these principles. And I would say particularly the principles where you perhaps don't score so well in, because it's really important to try and actually get everything out on the table for individuals really to understand one another and get a genuine understanding of how individuals feel the organisations can best achieve the outcomes. And I would use the EDI principle as one in particular to focus on. And the other suggestion that I would make when it comes to applying the governance code in your organisation is that often boards will just have it as an agenda item, along with reviewing the budget, looking at the management accounts, making a decision about a new project, all of those sort of what I would call the oversight of the operational matters. Whereas actually some of this stuff around governance, you need to come at it, you're not in decision making mode, you're sort of in reflection, mode and testing assumptions and understanding mode. So I would encourage perhaps either an away day to deal with that, or a separate component of the board meeting to do it. Where I'm a trustee, what we've been doing is we've had sort of business meetings, for want of a better word, and then we followed it up with a distinct hour with a governance consultant to help us specifically around particular aspects of the code. And that's really made a difference to the quality of our discussions and the quality of our thinking, because we're not in the transactional mode of what we'll approve the budget and then we'll move on to the next thing. We really genuinely explore things and have a different type of dialogue. Sorry if I've rambled on about that one a bit too much, but I really do think it is important how you engage at board level in these things, because it's not just about ticking a list of principles and recommendations. So you've made this assessment, then you've got to say, well, what do we need to help improve things? Now, going back to NCVO and their governance wheel, they have also got a tool, a micro tool for charities. And again, in terms of helping you with the what next stage, they ask you, so for example, this is under Principle 4, they ask you a series of questions to help really tease out what it is you should be putting in place to action some of these things. They also have a very simple template, nice and easy to use. None of that is rocket science, and I'm sure you can come up with your own. Where's the area of improvement? What's the action? By when? Who's going to do it? And it's nice and easy for you to prepare and for the board to monitor. And Deborah has a similar conclusion in her book and through the app as well. It's about creating an action plan and a timetable for monitoring things. Now, those frameworks are simpler, I think much easier to engage in. And what I've got there is just an example of one of them filled out. And you can see what we've done is sort of RAG rated them, so it's nice and easy on the eye. You can see whether something's delivered, whether something isn't. Then something that you might want to use as an alternative, and I would say probably larger boards might use it in this way, but this is actually something you can download from the steering group, the Charity Governance Code's actual website itself. Is what they have done is they have populated a table with all of the detailed recommendations in the code itself, really, and it gives you this opportunity to actually provide some evidence of application and an explanation of how you might apply it, and then identify areas for improvement or implementation. Now, sometimes what we've seen is we've seen management teams do the assessment and actually populate this with evidence of application and then present it in report format to the board to actually discuss. So it's just a different way of presenting it. And I think going back to the point about proportionality and thinking about what's right for you, think of these, I mean, these tools aren't wildly different, but maybe think about which one might be slightly better for you. And obviously you can tweak and tailor it should you wish as well. So in thinking about how you do it, who do you involve? Is it that the board do it on their own? Is it the management team do it and table it for the board, or is it a mix? I would suggest it's probably useful to have a mix of people within the management team and the board to do it. Maybe you have some larger organisations have governance subcommittees. You may have another subcommittee that exists already where this might fit with, or you might suggest maybe setting up a small task and start and finish group to address it. Do think about your own capacity. Everybody's jobs at the moment, I think we're all up to our ears. So, you know, have you got the skill set? Have you got the time to actually do it? And also try and parcel it up. Don't eat it all at once. You know, spread it over a number of meetings. Do it on a cyclical basis. There are lots of advisors out there who can help and support you. Maybe you can get some perspective from your independent examiners or your auditors just as part of the work they're doing as well. So think about your capacity. It is about continuous improvement, so you don't have to do it all at once. So spread it out at a pace you can cope with. So bite it off in chunks, whole thing. Do some sort of self-evaluation. You can either come at it by starting at the detail first, looking at the recommendations sort of and going upwards, or you can just say, we're not going to look at the detailed recommendations, but actually we're going to start at a very high level and discuss what do those principles mean to us as a board, and see if you draw out some priorities from that. It really just depends on the operating style of your board, and it's worth talking to your chair if they haven't already engaged in it, and your chief executive about really how are you going to get the best out of your board. You're going to have different characters, different skill sets. So what's really going to work with the board team itself? So you can separate it out, have an away day maybe, or have it as a routine part of the agenda, but maybe separate it out at the end of the board agenda or at the beginning. I've already mentioned the idea of a governance subcommittee, maybe for larger organisations. And in some of the really big national charities, of course, they're lucky enough to have a governance lead who can take all of that on board on behalf of the whole of the staff team and report up to the trustee board. I've mentioned a start and finish group. Do it yourself or look for external support, whether that's just the tools that are out there that are freely available, or maybe getting some help from somebody. So the other thing, now these aren't really addressed specifically in the Charity Governance Code, but I would say they are the basics around finances. And if you're just going to start off small and thinking maybe what small nudges you could make to improve the basic governance around the financial piece, maybe that's the bit that you only feel really is in your control. You know, it's obviously all the basic hygiene factors. Do you have an hour in your calendar that is aligned with the board meetings, so the board knows when routinely it's going to get the budget, the management accounts, the statutory accounts, when it's going to connect with the auditors, all of those key things. You know, simple things like adequate spacing between subcommittees and board meetings so that papers can be updated, you know, particularly around, you know, if there's more information around the finances that needs to be collated before you get to the board. So just simple timing issues. Those are little nudges that can actually create a qualitative improvement to your governance. Clearly delegated authorities to subcommittees, that sometimes does go awry in the finance arena where it's not clear what the finance committee is allowed to get on and do. And the other thing that I think, going back to this point that the financial responsibility of trustees is challenging, but it's key, is really in trying to address the aspects of building confidence in people, because we know that we get lots of highly skilled people on boards, people very committed to the cause, but ask them to read a balance sheet and they'll run for the hills. So how can you build their confidence? How can you create a safe space for trustees? Think about how it's included in their induction, and also reflect when you're attending trustee meetings. What are you seeing? What are you hearing? What's that telling you about engagement in the finances? And maybe thinking about, well, what could we do differently next time? Could we present the accounts in maybe a more sort of truncated version? Maybe we use graphics, maybe we present a glossary, maybe we do a verbal presentation. You know, what actually is going to connect with the trustees? The huge challenge for trustees is the gaps between meetings, and they just simply do not, and I speak for myself, always remember some of the issues which were discussed at the previous meeting. So how can you present stuff to trustees in a way that engages them? So evolving the reporting really to improve the quality of the financial governance. So keep hearing, keep listening, keep seeing what's going on, and also creating safe spaces. So offering individual trustees the opportunity to talk to you about the finance piece. And obviously the relationship between the finance lead and the treasurer is really important. You know, you want your treasurer to constructively challenge, to test your assumptions, to help you in your thinking. But you do need to be a partnership when you rock up to committee meetings and boards, because, you know, you both ultimately want the same thing and the same responses out of the trustee board. You want to enable them, you want to interpret the numbers from them, but equally you want them to be able to engage in the numbers and do the job that they're there to do as well. Final point, I did say it's about including some sort of narrative in the annual report and accounts. You'll get these slides, and I have included a few descriptions from the 2020 reporting round. So Akivo, there's a couple of slides on what they've talked about. So they very specifically talked about the extent to which they've met some recommendations and where things aren't completed and what they're going to do about it. And they've also said when they're going to next do a self-assessment. So the point about continuous improvement. I've got an example of what London Youth have said in their annual report. You don't have to write War and Peace. And I know that London Youth a few years ago did win an award for the application of the governance code in their organisation. And that one was one where, if memory you certainly right, that was where management actually led that and engaged with the trustees. And it was, I think, a good example of gaining a common understanding about respective responsibilities. And then that's a much bigger organisation, obviously, with the RNLI from 2019 and what they were saying. So again, not War and Peace, but just marking it out and saying, you know, the Charity Governance Code is an important tool. It's there to help us improve, make our governance more effective, and we've engaged in it. So I think it's about building trust and confidence amongst your stakeholder group and giving them the reassurance that you're engaging in this. That's really a bit of a summary of the steps that I've talked through. So we can take some questions now. But I'd like you just to ponder that question. Having said, you know, where do you score yourself at 10? You're, you know, 5, a 7, a 9. I hope some of the things that I've said may strike a chord. They may simply just reconfirm some of the things you knew already, but I hope that will give you confidence. Maybe it's got you thinking about something you could do differently within your organisation. But if you're a 5, you know, what single action do you think you need to take away from today's session, maybe to get you to a 6? You know, if you're an 8, what's going to get you to a 9? And, you know, and if you're a 0 or a 1, what's really going to get you off the starting block? You know, what's the single thing that you can do to take away, to take you on to the next level? So do have a think about that. And then I've got some slides here. There's lots of material out there. The one website I didn't mention was what was formerly known as the Institute of Chartered Secretaries and Administrators, which is the Governance Institute. They've got lots of downloadable stuff. They've got competency frameworks, skills mix stuff, all sorts of things that can help you with governance. You know, organisations like Getting on Board and Reach, as well as Akivo, NCBO and DSC, lots of material on there around governance, particularly around recruiting trustees, which may be a good place to start on the EDI piece. And then obviously the likes of the Association of Chairs and so on have got very useful information for chairs on how to support governance. And the two important things, I think, for from the trustees' point of view from the Charity Commission are CC3 and CC27. It's your decision.